It's being reported that the Nurses' Union, the Royal College of Nursing, is considering balloting for strike action as a direct result of the 1% pay rise, viewed by many as shockingly low, that the government proposed last week. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the law on strikes. First of all, it's important to remember that an all-out strike isn't the only option available to nurses. They can refuse to work overtime. They can refuse to do paperwork and just provide frontline care. All these different options, all different types of industrial action are available, which would have less impact and, frankly, less bad PR than a full-blown strike. But it's actually trickier than you'd think for a union to call out a strike or to take any other form of industrial action. First of all, the Nurses' Union has to give the employer, which is each of the NHS trusts up and down the country, a week's notice of the strike ballot and send them the ballot paper 3 days before it's sent out to the nurses. The ballot papers have to be sent to all the nurses eligible to vote and to nobody else. Now, although very minor mistakes here won't matter, sometimes you get the situation where an employer gets an injunction to stop a strike going ahead because the union's records aren't sufficiently up to date. Happens surprisingly often. And if the union's address records aren't sufficiently up to date, they can encounter problems with proving that they sent ballot papers to everybody who's eligible to vote, but nobody else, nobody who's retired, died, etc. To authorise a strike, at least 50% of all members of the union have to vote. So that means a strike can't be called if it's only supported by a militant minority. And then at least 50% of those voting have to vote in favour. 50% of all members have to vote. 50% of all those voting have to vote in favour. Now, that used to be the law for a long, long time for any type of strike. But there's now a third requirement. You've got the 50% have to vote, 50% of those voting vote in favour. A third requirement which may or may not apply. It's a new law that hasn't been tested in the context of nurses yet in the courts, and it was brought in by David Cameron's government in 2016. And the new law says that for workers in important public services, I'll explain what that means in just a moment. For workers in important public services, not only do 50% of the members have to vote and 50% of those voting have to vote in favour of a strike, but, bear with me because I'm afraid there's a few numbers here and it gets a bit complicated, 40% of those entitled to vote must have voted in favour of the strike. Now, let me just put some numbers on that. I know it's a bit headachy. It means that, say, if 60% of those voting vote in favour of a strike, but only 60% of members actually voted, then a strike is going to be against the law because only 36% of those eligible to vote, 60% of 60%, only 36% of those eligible to vote have supported the strike, and it needs to reach a 40% minimum. Now, that's a new law that came in 2016 for important public services. And important public services includes health services, but limited to, and I'm summarising here, this is really important for knowing how easy it's going to be for nurses to go on strike, limited to nurses working in A&E and nurses working in high dependency and intensive care units. Now, I am simplifying here, but if more than half the nurses working for the NHS spend more than half their time working in accident and emergency or ICU, then this third requirement, 40% of all those entitled to vote must vote in favour, probably applies. If not, it probably doesn't. I don't know whether it does or doesn't. As I say, it's not yet been tested in the context of hospital strikes by nurses, but it's going to be a real hard-fought battle in the courts over whether nurses can strike if 40% of those eligible to vote don't vote in favour. Final point, if there's a successful ballot and it's got to be counted by an independent scrutineer, the union has to give the employer the result and give at least 14 days' notice before a strike can take place. That means including the time to organise the ballot, arrange for ballot papers to be counted by someone independent, giving the 14 days notice, the whole process takes at least a month. So just to be clear on this, notwithstanding what you might read in the newspapers, even if the nurses' unions were to start the process tomorrow. Our NHS nurses are not going to be striking next week. If they move at the fastest speed they can, the earliest they can go on strike will be sometime in April.